Hi, welcome to Ms. Richardson's U.S. History 5-Minute Lectures. This information will be U.S. Notes 3.7, Homefront and Workers. It includes information that aligns with the second section on your Unit 3 study guide. Now remember, you have control over the lecture. Use your study guide to help you take those notes, pause whenever you need to, write down your questions, and rewatch if you need to, or rewind. Let's go ahead and get started. In the last set of notes, I mentioned that propaganda was created to encourage every American to support the war efforts. While many young men, both whites and minorities, enlisted to go fight for their country, other Americans were joining the war effort in less obvious and sometimes less traditional ways. Who were these minorities? They were African Americans, women, Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Japanese Americans. They all had a very distinct experiences during the war. These groups and their actions in World War II actually helped to shape the future of the U.S. Now we're going to talk about 4 of the 5 groups. Japanese Americans will be in our next set of notes. First, we'll look at African Americans at home and at war. On the home front, African Americans still face prejudices and discrimination. Many factories resisted hiring African Americans for war work. The African Americans were so upset by this, they actually threatened to march on Washington, D.C. to gain fair treatment. In response, Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802, forcing fair hiring practices. It said, in part, there will be, and I quote, no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin. While this did help in some areas, prejudice continued in northern cities, and it even led to some riots during the war. At the same time, many African American men joined the military. They were forced to serve in segregated units, live in segregated facilities, and most never even saw combat. There were instances of African American units that did see combat, like the Tuskegee Airmen, which are pictured here in the center. But most served support roles throughout the war. Many of these men fought for victory over racism in Europe and for victory over racism here at home. This paved the way for a desegregated military in 1948, right after the war, and that was really a precursor to the civil rights movement. Women also faced challenges both at home and abroad. Many young women actually joined the military. For the first time, women took clerical and administrative jobs in the military, freeing up more men for combat. Many also served as nurses and hospital workers. Female groups were created within the branches of the armed forces, including groups called the WACs, which was in the Army, the WAVES in the Navy, the USMCWR, in the Marines, and SPARS in the Coast Guard. At home, women were actually recruited to do industrial jobs that men had traditionally done. Because of the shortage of young male workers, women worked in factories doing very physical work that they had not done before. The new view of the female worker is symbolized by Rosie the Riveter. She's the one right there in the middle that you know, the We Can Do It poster. She's an iconic American image of a female working in a traditional male role. Most women left the workforce after the war, but their success in these jobs changed attitudes about women in the workforce, and it's going to lead to some change in the future. Native Americans, specifically the Navajo, played an important role in the war efforts in the Pacific theater of the war. So we've talked about women, we've talked about African Americans, now Native Americans. A very small number of Navajo used their native language in code to transmit messages throughout the Pacific. This code is the only military code that was never broken. Part of that's based on the Navajo language, the fact that it was never a written language, and does not translate easily to other types of languages. These few men played an integral part in the battles in the Pacific against Japan. And finally, the Hispanic Americans also helped with the war efforts. In 1942, the U.S. actually created a program called the Bracero Program to encourage farm workers and other workers to come into the U.S. from Mexico. We needed workers in order to grow and harvest enough food for our troops and our country. This program arranged for workers to come to the U.S. to help with the harvest, to build roads, and to maintain railroads. While the program existed for over 20 years, it did not stop the prejudice that existed in the U.S., prejudice that eventually led to things like the Zoot Suit riots. These riots in Southern California exemplified the tensions between the two races. Part of it was seen as the Mexican style, the Zoot Suits, were unsupportive of the war efforts because they used too much cloth. That was why they're called the Zoot Suit riots. Even though over 500,000 Hispanic Americans, 80% of those were Mexican Americans, fought in World War II for the U.S., there was really no change in the discrimination these groups faced later on. Even with the advancements these military groups made during World War II, when the war ended, life was expected to go back to normal. Women and minorities were expected to leave their jobs so that the returning white men could have them. There was not lasting change from World War II, but there was a desire for change that had not been there in many of the groups before this. So this is the end of U.S. Notes 3.7. Hopefully you learned something and bring those questions to class.